The Damsel of Misrule by A.Z. Stargrave.
Content warning. This is a story inspired by 1980s pulp fiction soap operas and damsel in distress stories, with all that implies.
And what that implies is terribly toxic people doing horrible things to each other with incredibly dubious levels of consent.
So please keep that in mind while listening.
Prelude. Regna's Road. Traditional Qualties folk lament.
Along Regna's road, where shadows softly tread, she walks in silence, heart laden with dread.
Angel of the moon and guardian of youth, preserve the virtue of a girl's unspoken truth.
Secret hearts beat in time with her own as they travel paths unseen, unknown.
The blessing hand guides her to see
The day ahead where we all will be free.
Honor without measure and greatness untold.
Await Regna's own,
Who walk Regna's road. Act 1. Preserving the angel in the house.
The story thus far. Once there was a princess locked in a tower, languishing in captivity and surrounded by enemies while awaiting her forced marriage to the evil prince. These stories often end with the valiant knight setting things right and claiming the damsel in distress as his own. This is not one of those stories.
Wakes her up in the middle of the night, all the time gone by. She ain't done nothing right. She sees nothing but years in front of them. They're all fools. They're all fools.
About the second has been dead under a super highway. She loves the world, but she's got this on spare. About the second has been dead under a super highway. She loves the world, but she's got this on spare. Trapped on the right track. Trapped on the right track. Trapped on the right track.
And the years keep going by.
Trapped on the right track. Trapped on the right track. Trapped on the right track.
That you'll probably die.
Before she does anything good. It's like I want to save the world. It's really
Indecision, motivation, obligation, exploitation. Won't she does anything?
But she does anything.
Won't she does anything?
But she does anything.
Yeah, won't she does anything?
But she does anything.
Won't she does anything?
But she does anything.
Chapter 1. Angela Deluna's debut do-over.
As I grunted, drew in my breath, and allowed my dressers to squeeze me into a body briefer designed to accentuate all my assets without looking like they're accentuating all my assets, two thoughts run through my mind. First up, this is the least glamorous I have ever felt in my life. Second up, Archie would love to hear about this. I don't normally describe my routine in this kind of romance novel detail. Men often believe women think about the things men find interesting much more than we actually do. Getting ready to interact with the world on the terms it demands is not a burlesque act. It's a chore. And that goes triple for layered shapewear, which is to underwear what a bed of nails is to a mattress. But filtering it through Archie's perspective makes it more tolerable to get into these ridiculous suspenders and stockings before I even get dressed. I looked in the mirror of my home's extensive dressing room while I drew up the stockings, making sure the lines in back are perfect and Cuban heels line up flawlessly. My home? Is that how I put it? I'm not sure I can say that with a straight face. Claire de Lune Manor, my family's longtime mansion in Summersfall, New Hampshire, is where I grew up and where I live now. But it damn sure doesn't feel like home. You would generally think of putting on undergarments and stockings as a solo undertaking. maybe an assistant or two if you're having a wedding or the like, but my dressing routine was a team effort, especially on this of all days. Instead of the intimate privacy between the lady and her maid that I often felt with Archie, I felt like a network anchor surrounded by assistants putting on makeup before going live. I was continuously keenly aware of multiple eyes on me. My dressers took over the task of attaching my stockings to garters hanging from my lacy waistband to prepare me for the country club's exclusive Summersfall Labor Day charity golf tourney. The dressers were mostly freelancers, stylists hired for the day, all working for Ashley Benton, my family's longtime designer who was a platinum blonde, shoulder-padded total relic from the 80s, and even more proud of it. Her people got away with wearing pink scrubs, unlike our housekeepers, that my Aunt Cassie insists wear classic black formal uniforms while working for us. That was new. One of her ideas ever since Dad died and she took over the family. Funny, Archie used to wear her maid uniform while doing this kind of thing for me. I loved it then. I don't love it now. My family comes from money. Old money, and lots of it. We live differently than you do. You have no idea. Everyone here had a mission, after all, serving a singular purpose. Remedial wife-bot studies, so Angela Eleanor Deluna learns to be a proper lady, stay in her place, and doesn't embarrass the Deluna name again. Daydreaming about Archie could only carry me so far, though. I didn't want to dress up, and I definitely didn't want to attend Summersfall as the de facto guest of honor. But free will, or at least my free will, is not part of the equation. That's what all this reminiscing is really about. It keeps me from thinking about the real tragedy. I was never going to see Archie again. I would never feel her hands massaging my shoulders, never again hand off something to my left and know she'd take it without my having to ask, never hear her intone, "Perish the thought, ma'am," like a bit player in a BBC drama. We'd never hang out with Skye and Burgundy and the rest of Thornback Island at the old goth club, or spend late nights at the old bookstore making up crazy stories about the meaning of life. I had nothing left from the era but memories and a cat, and most of the people around me would make me give those up too if they thought they could get away with it. The end of all my lives. The end of everything I thought I knew. The end of history. My dad once said something like that. I wish I paid more attention. All that identity gone, in favor of the trope of the ideal perfect wife on the prowl. I sat and stared at the mirror blankly. Primly and properly, of course, hands folded in my lap, ankles tucked modestly together beneath the chair, just as I'd been trained by the most dedicated etiquette instructors in the world. Others fussed over my hair and makeup, taking great care to get everything exactly right, making me as pretty and artificial as a Barbie doll. When I was young, imagining what a billowing white wedding day would look like, I still didn't envision the prep required to make me look like I wasn't even trying. The illusion of normalcy still baffles me. Aunt Cassie came up behind me and laid her hands on my shoulders. It should have been a comforting touch, a proud guardian. But it was also a very evil stepmother type of grip, if you catch my drift. Cassandra Deluna, last matriarch of the Deluna clan. My late father's brother's wife, now my guardian and the closest thing to God that has ever existed in my life, looking over me with judgmental aristocratic eyes, perfectly coiffed hair, and immaculate clothing. Lady Dimitrescu as played by Christine Baranski.
I know you'll do us proud today, Angela,
she said with the perfect smile and accent she had spent decades cultivating. Even if I weren't raised in the pit of vipers that makes up this social circle, I would recognize the dangerous glint behind the words. She gestured to the small army that had been attending to me since early morning.
You carry all our spirits and love with you now.
Nearby, one of the maids stumbled and only just barely managed not to dump the entire tray of used glasses she was carrying. Aunt Cassie shot her a glare that could burn through steel.
Bridget, do you have any idea how much blood, tears, and sweat have been shed to make Angela look absolutely perfect today? If your clumsiness ruins her coming out, I swear I'll have your hide.
Bridget didn't make eye contact during her scolding.
I am sorry, mademoiselle. I will be more careful.
Then she slunk away with a shamed face. I twitched inwardly. Her fake accent might be the worst thing that's happened to the French since 1940, but she didn't deserve such treatment. My father would never have addressed the servants that way. and neither would I. Well, not these servants at any rate. Cassie stared daggers at Bridget, then leaned down and whispered in my ear in a low hiss that only I could hear.
That goes for you too. One instance of that wildcat behavior, and you won't be able to sit for a week.
I just nodded and slid back into my seat as one of the attendants went to work on my hair. Once again, a moment Archie would have loved witnessing. She's a bit of an emotional masochist. Okay, more than a bit, and would just eat up the kind of abuse Cassie piled on Bridget. Archie was what I often called Araceli Blackwell, occasionally my maid, often a confidant, always my best friend. It's a small in-joke to the idea of mistresses of the past using shorter nicknames on their maid's full name, and also a reference to the fact that she goes by Archibald in her life all the rest of the time. When she gives up feminine trappings and has to disguise herself as the man society has believed she was since she was born. Araceli Blackwell is not her birth name, but it's her real one. Archie is her other real name, a familiar nickname only I get to use as the employer to her maid self. Her birth certificate reads Archibald Nicodemus Wainwright, which honestly feels like a name that should match the aristocratic world I live in rather than hers. Ha ha ha. She's got a weird relationship with gender. She dresses feminine most of the time when she's not at work, but she doesn't really come alive unless she's serving as a maid. It's not even about the uniform, it's about attitude. But the uniform helps. Somewhere on the gender spectrum, there's a little dot marked full-time maidservant, and Archie lives there as much as she can. I still thought of her in present tense. I needed to stop that. I hadn't seen her in a year, and I was never likely to see her again. I felt something fuzzy press up against my leg, and smiled. I reached down and scratched B-Dub on his back. B-Dub was the one thing I brought back with me from the bookstore I once owned. Bookworm, we called him, or B-Dub for short. I sometimes tell people he's my cat, but even by cat standards, that's a misnomer. He and I just seem to be traveling in the same direction. He was an orange street cat on the border of the dock district, just trying his best to find some food and get by. From experiences in another lifetime, I sympathized. I'd start leaving food out for him, and he'd show up and meow, very loudly I might add, at the door for more. Eventually, he just started coming in when someone opened the door, and I never bothered shooing him out. He's been a part of my life ever since. I doubt I could get rid of him if I actually tried. 3 maids scurried around handling errands and small tasks. Melinda, chief maid, a dignified older woman who had worked for my family for 10 years. Sylvie, a younger maid who had been working for Melinda for a while. Brisk, efficient, never talked much unless there was business. And of course, Bridget, Melinda's newest employee, who apparently believed that she could make up for her clumsiness with a fake French accent and makeup that looked like it had been applied with a spray can.
Hello there, Trad Squad.
Oh, and my cousin. Her chipper voice snapped me out of the self-pitying spiral, not for the first time, and probably not for the last.
Penny Deluna coming at you live with honestly the biggest event I've brought to you in years.
At least I knew this was coming. Penny was probably looking right into her camera phone and positioned perfectly so my face was visible in the mirror behind her. I tried to paste on a smile. I don't think it worked.
It's been years in the making and 6 months of planning, and I'm so proud the day has come for the debut do-over. After 10 years out in the wild, everyone's back where they belong.
She stepped back a bit, into my field of peripheral vision in the mirror, and I could see her smiling at me.
My dear beloved cousin, Angela Deluna, is returning to high society.
Ah, Penny. 15 feet of boundless energy, all squeezed down into a 5'0" perky strawberry blonde package. The youngest of my aunt's 3 daughters, age 22, and as yet unmarried, she was just about the only person around here I could stand. Her dad died when she was a kid, in the same accident that killed my mother. For all intents and purposes, my own late dad, Daniel Deluna, was her father figure. Technically, he was my stepdad, but I never thought of him that way. Even with the estrangement between Dad and I, he was 50 times the father my deadbeat sperm donor ever had been.
This really is a special day. Proper behavior, training, spectacle, these are all the things that make debuts great. This isn't exactly the same as a debut event, but I guarantee Angie will be the center of attention nonetheless. Next to the spring debut, Summersfall is the biggest social event of the season. And it fits, you know? The change of seasons is a great time to step up and ask the big questions. To ask, who is Angela Deluna? And step in front of the world and answer.
Well, isn't that the question of the hour? Little orphan Angie, all grown up. Poor kid abandoned by dad. Rich kid adopted by better dad. Successful Regna's own, incredibly failed wife. Goth club chick, bookseller. And, so I'm told, a truly unique flower and jewel of womanhood. I have a certificate for that, and my own theme song and everything. Penny gave a bright smile and peace sign to the camera.
Anyway, now that Angie is going to be all respectable and stuff, Trad Squad, drop your favorite bit of advice in the comments.
It is not fit affection should be forced, I murmured, as a memory best left undisturbed flitted across my mind.
What's that, mademoiselle?
I hadn't noticed Bridget re-entering the room. She gave me a concerned look as I shook off the sad expression coming over my face. She almost triggered another memory. At the overseas residential charm school from hell where I learned my harshest lessons, they called us Mademoiselle. Feminine and soft and vulnerable and French, I suppose. I hated how it sounded when they said it. That strange combo of false respect and genuine disdain that colors so many terms for women and reminded us that we were literally prisoners. I would want to punch anyone calling me Mademoiselle just on general principle. But Bridget's butchering of the word made it tolerable. Maybe not endearing, but tolerable. Nothing, I said, only slightly louder. Just a memory. Behind me, Penny was still going on.
My own debut is probably the high point of my life, except for my wedding, whenever the good Lord guides me to the right man. Imagine getting another go at a debut.
Good for her. I mean it. Social debut is a huge deal in this circle, and she loved every moment of hers. Me, I considered my own to be a dull chore, but she loved all the same stuff I found so oppressive, the posture training, ballet lessons, walking downstairs with a book on her head, sitting and holding tea while looking impressive but not too impressive. She's probably right that her wedding will be the culmination of all her dreams. At least, I hope she is. I don't actually resent her feelings on this. Quite the opposite. I hope she finds someone and lives out her dream of cooking, arranging flowers, chairing social organizations, e-sportsing, raising kids, and basically catering to the man in her life. There's happiness to be found in this domestic existence, and I don't begrudge it to anyone. I just wish I wasn't being forced to follow the same path. She scampered over to me, phone in hand. A few other friends followed with cameras as well. Penny is internet famous, I think. I don't know exactly how far, but she's big on social media under the name Trad Squad and has her own fan base. Traditional wife, happy life, that's their motto. Posts all the time about how she's preparing to be a stay-at-home housewife, embody traditional roles, and please her future husband, who doesn't exist yet. Real 1950s Americana stuff. The kind of people who follow her are big on what they call Stepford fashion, which they do not use ironically, if that tells you anything. And for weeks, the primary preoccupation of the never-ending Penny Deluna show was all about my return. Penny scampered over to me now that there was a little time and space to get me on camera. She's sharp at this online branding thing. She didn't show a good look at me until hair and makeup were locked in.
So, how does this compare to your first debut, big cousin?
I smiled thinly. It bordered on being real. I never could say no to her. Well, there was a lot more pomp and community theater the first time around. I glanced at Cassie and made sure this wasn't going to upset her. It helped. I was totally telling the truth. I seemed to recall a lot of ball gowns and a sword arch and a lot of curtsying choreographed down to the second. This is just me coming back. Game face, Angie, game face. I let a smile spread over me. My friends wouldn't fall for it, but this place would. And I'm so grateful to be embraced once more.
And how are you feeling?
I had been expecting this. So at least I had an answer ready. One advantage of getting world-class etiquette training is that you can switch the on-camera face on and off like a light switch. Like I'm carrying all the spirits and love, and I glanced at Aunt Cassie, of my mom and dad. The only thing making this tolerable was Penny. I could at least play the dutiful daughter for her without having to do it between clenched teeth. She was far too innocent for me to unload my anger upon. Everyone who ever helped love me into being is part of this day, and I want to live up to them all and make my parents proud. I think I ripped off most of that from Mr. Rogers. When you're a poor kid, PBS raises you. But I can still appreciate the elegance of the ceremony, the dividing line between what was and what will be. That was an entirely different memory, a happy one that tasted bittersweet now precisely because said happiness was so very far away. Penny either didn't notice or completely ignored the momentary frostiness between Cassie and me.
And there's no better example of the fourth commandment than that, Trad Squad.
She chirped into the phone. She slipped it into her purse and gave me a kiss on the forehead, then twirled off with entourage in tow. I guess she's what the kids these days call an influencer. She likes dressing up in cute outfits and live streaming video gaming while she narrates tradwife stuff to her followers. The combo of her neon pink room, bubbly voice, and wholesome adorableness really gets the streaming crowd going. Her life's ambition besides marriage is to form an esports team that both kicks ass and spreads the gospel of traditional wifery, one-upping the whole existing subculture of evangelical Christian esports gamers. A real good match for how much our home under Cassie's rule felt like something out of time, wrapping me in a world I most certainly never made. Getting women to wear traditional maid uniforms and do this kind of grunt work has never been easy, and sometimes we take what we can get. We had no full-time servants, but Melinda's maid staffing agency was able to have 1 or 2 people at our place during work hours most days. Pity that I probably couldn't get Archie in here as a maid. That would at least be funny. Archie. I think that's what I hate most about Cassie getting it into her head to turn the manor into what sometimes felt like a Downton Abbey LARP. I guess that's one thing she and I have in common. I've been running my own maid roleplay for years, and all these black and white worker bees scurrying around just reminds me of what I've lost. When my dad was alive, he never would have allowed this kind of thing. He was a practical man. But Cassie likes things being done in certain proper old ways, and that includes the daughters of the family doing exactly what they're told, and service from maids wearing crisply pressed black uniforms with white aprons. She has an image to uphold, after all. The steady fizzling away of the platonic ideal of maid service was one of those things that most concerned the people who controlled my life. The patriarchs and matriarchs who rule over this aristocratic scene call themselves the preservers. Preservers of a way of life, preservers of women's virtue, preservers of the way things once were. Preserving me, a perfectly dressed dancing girl in a snow globe, preserved under glass, never changing, ever smiling. I'm 29 years old. I've been an adult for a decade. I ran a successful business more or less single-handedly for most of that time. Someone else is putting my dress on over my head for me. I'm being treated like a teenage princess being prepared for betrothal, and even that's a step up from the daily way I'm treated like a child. After 10 years as the family black sheep, Angela Deluna is coming back home to polite society, to attract a man and settle down, to take my place among the respectable ladies of wealthy society here in Summersfall, New Hampshire, and there's nothing I can do about it. I met Archie through the goth and subculture scenes several years ago and became fast friends. I can count the number of times I've seen her presenting as a man on one hand. She had a strong, submissive maid thing and a need to serve someone she could idolize. I was deeply lonely in my disastrous marriage and needed someone to idolize me. We made a good match, traveling through the alternative scenes like I owned the place and her following along like a perfect Victorian maid, right down to the apron and flawless posture. She works in tech for her day job and does quite well for herself, and really enjoys letting go of the modern world for what she sees as old-world simplicity. I can appreciate that, honestly. She was very much into all this aristocratic air and dressing. My path to this point started simple at first. I gave up a promising future in my family's wealthy social circle to get married to Blake Carraway, a hippie guy I met at college. I never cared about my family's money anyway. Most people assume I was so freaked out by evil charm school that it drove me away from our society. And that's close enough to the truth that I just let them keep believing it. Even Archie doesn't know why I really left. Blake flashed the right smile and said all the right things about freedom and feminism and free love. We opened an indie bookstore together with a little help from my stepdad, Angela Deluna, who was a surprisingly good sport about it all, given how tense we were when I distanced myself from the family. Thorn books, we called it, after Thornback, the word for an aging spinster. Some of my friends and I at the Goth Club called ourselves Thornback Island. And it worked. The first few years were great. I loved running the store. I loved my friends. I loved living as Angela Caraway, quiet bookstore manager, by day, and Angie Thornback, eccentric blue-haired goth chick, by night. Then Blake got more and more controlling. A few years later, after nearly a decade of marriage, he complained I was holding him back, drained our joint account and bankrupted the store, then ran off to found a free love compound with several women considerably younger than me. My stepdad was good enough to let me stay with him for a while, even after I'd basically abandoned the family. I always appreciated that he never said, "I told you so." The plan was easy enough. Move into Dad's place for a few months or so, get back on my feet, get my life together, and get a job for the long term before I move back out. Dad was kind of annoyed about my ex running off with the not inconsiderable business loan he had given us, so he insisted on a temporary conservatorship over my finances as part of the deal. I guess he worried I was going to drain away the rest of his fortune. Anyway, I accepted it. What else was I going to do? But then he died unexpectedly, leaving a chaotic stock trading empire in his wake. His sister-in-law, the only remaining relative besides me and her kids, was his executor, and, as it turns out, the new conservator over me as well. I could fight it, but with what lawyer and what money? Not to mention that my family is the type that doesn't worry about whether the local legal system will support them. So I'm pretty much stuck here, beholden to my father's brother's wife's idea of what a real lady is like, and a tradwife future on the horizon. The preservers are going to get their way. #FreeAngela. That was 6 months ago, and I'm not leaving anytime soon. When I do, it'll be when my new husband carries me over the threshold to our bright, shiny lives. What new husband? No clue. I haven't met him yet. That's what all this business is about. I'm being returned to the flock today at the country club where my family has been members since the 1890s. At the Summersfall golf tourney, a cute little pun I'm sure the founders were quite pleased with themselves over. The social event of the season. Quite literally. Okay, stick with me here, because it's complicated, but it matters. Dad's estate is tied up in a lot of things even the accountants have trouble understanding. My aunt is essentially taking over. There's a considerable trust fund lined up for me as well, the kind with a lot more zeros than most people can wrap their minds around. I don't really understand the basics of the fund. It was created by my father decades before I was even born, when he dropped a couple of $1,000,000 into the stock market and left it there for his children. I'm told it exercises arcane rules that have stood up to the strongest attempts to break them in many prior cases. Long story short, the money belongs to me, sort of free and clear of any family or estate debts, but can't be claimed by anyone but my spouse. Because of course a girl in this circle can't have access to her own vast fortune. All I have to do is marry someone the conservator, Aunt Cassie, approves of before I'm 30, and that automatically unlocks the money and puts it and me under my husband's control.
You can imagine how closely my aunt is guarding that gate.
I'm being all dolled up to see if I can escape spinsterhood. It was unthinkable enough when I abandoned this circle and tried to make my own way. Worse still that I come here as a divorcee. But my ex-husband didn't matter, not in their eyes. He was a youthful fling that unfortunately ran a little long, which will be easily forgotten once I've fluttered my eyelashes, flirted with the group, put on coy eyes, and eventually attracted a man from the similarly aging cohort. After that, living out a domestic life, raising rich little children, and keeping my man happy. That's what all this training was about, after all. And if I don't manage to get married before the year is out? Well, that's the thing about being sent to your personal purgatory once. They can always hold the threat of a one-way return trip over your head. I'm not afraid of much, but I'm afraid of that. Because I grew up around money, well, after a certain point anyway, I was trained to have servants around, people doing my hair and makeup, all that. The fussing doesn't bug me. But it wasn't really until Archie entered my life, long after I abandoned the country club world, that I started liking it. Again, I helped Archie transition to femininity. My youthful training and refined social graces didn't do me much good, but what I passed on did wonders for her. We used to joke that it was a shame she'd been stuck studying software engineering in the Navy and I was trapped wearing plaid tartan skirts and learning to walk with a book on my head. We'd have both been so much happier in the other's place. She loved hearing my stories about being trained in classical femininity from a young age. Ballet classes with a cranky old-school dance mistress who wasn't above a quick snap to the back of the legs with her walking stick. Finishing school lessons on everything from how to daintily eat soup to how to modestly fold your feet behind each ankle and signal what a virtuous person you are, etiquette for hours. All topped off by a year abroad in a nation you've never heard of on what was euphemistically called an intensive etiquette retreat, but was really just mind-numbing torture with a veneer of respectability. You could present me to the Queen of England tomorrow and I'd make a perfect impression. Perfect. God, I hated every second of all that. Non-stop misery. So it's no wonder I abandoned it as soon as I had a chance. You'd think it would be difficult to remember it in that detail, but weirdly enough, telling her all these stories helped me expel it. And the more detail, the better. A bit of bizarre mental hacking, but it worked better than therapy. Cheaper, too. Which reminds me of one last person flitting around this scene I should mention. Actually, not flitting. More like silently gliding. A small but stern figure in black hair and glasses whose clothing and tight hair bun make her look older than her 25 years. Josephine Hedges, officially my aunt's assistant, but honestly more of a professional chaperone to Penny and I. Not exactly a member of the family, but much more than a mere servant either. She's in charge of our day-to-day lives and scheduling and just generally keeping an eye on us. My aunt is very busy, but Josephine handles a lot of the details. Very brisk and efficient, whether she's scheduling a round-trip overseas flight for my aunt or deciding I need to be locked in my room for rule breaking. She's somewhere between a governess, jailer, and God, and somehow less merciful than any of them. "Enjoying yourself, Ms. Hedges?" I asked aloud to break up the silence. She stopped and gave this a moment's thought. Josephine doesn't do small talk. Ever. I think it's against her programming.
Given that my responsibility is to deliver into this circle as virtuous and well-mannered a young lady as possible, everything is going according to plan. So yes, as long as this remains orderly, I will find it quite enjoyable.
I stifled a laugh. You know, the only difference between you and sci-fi androids is that they want to sound more human than they are.
A waste of perfectly good programming, if you ask me, young lady.
I can always count on you for the Vulcan perspective, ma'am. We both laughed politely and went about our business. Any resemblance between this performance and actual good humor is purely coincidental. I can argue with Josephine and suffer, or I can play nice and things are 5% less hellish, because unlike most of the other people here, Josephine can really hurt me. Corporal punishment is a thing in my life. Honestly, any punishment she or my aunt sees fit is a thing in my life. I don't get paddled or spanked very often, because I'm trying to keep a low profile while I figure this stuff out, but Josephine has broad authority to do what she deems necessary to keep me out of trouble. Penny, who is very devoutly Christian and tends to confess to even the smallest wrongdoing because she's so easily overcome by guilt, ironically ends up getting spanked or disciplined more than I do. To say it seems weird to be spanked against my will by a woman a few years my junior is an understatement. Smoke and mirrors, virtue and good manners. That's what all this is. Property rights. I'm a precious thing, a case full of jewels, valued by everyone but also locked behind a glass wall at all times, and traded around in custody, all with a polite smile on my face. Worst of all is the purity culture that floats around here like background radiation. We're the kind of rich people that have yearly purity balls with big ticket outfits and teenage girls pledging their virginity to their fathers. Mom put her foot down on that one and Dad respected her wishes after she passed on, so at least I never had to do that when I was 13. But that doesn't mean I'm off scot-free. I signed all kinds of abstinence pledges in Catholic school that I have to admit I didn't exactly pay much attention to. But then, at that charm school, they brought chastity obsession to entirely new levels. A fixation on purity that even completely banned self-touch. I went without any kind of relief for the 13 months I was there, and now I've gone with no self-touch whatsoever for the whole time back home, with Josephine paying very close attention to ensure my virtue and purity, whatever that's supposed to mean. That's another old-timey feminine ideal Archie likes, and one she's welcome to as long as I don't have to live it. For her, gender isn't about body parts. It's about a role where she can feel safe and protected and cared for, in exchange for putting herself on display and being a domestic goddess. As I take a deep breath while my makeup is being done and feel the pressure of the girdle strapped around my waist, I wonder if I'm being protected or just jailed. See, that's exactly the kind of intimate detail Archie loved to hear all about. She would give anything to be in my place right now. She's often said she feels guilty about that because she knows it's so miserable for me. But we have an agreement of total candor with each other. So many people have lied to us in our lives that it was refreshing to have someone who promised to only be truthful, no matter how it might hurt. So she confessed how pleasing she would find the experiences I loathed. I could honestly tell her it was fine, that I was glad the stories of my experiences could make someone happy. It was like, by putting all those experiences into her and letting her savor them, it expelled them out of me. We used each other's perspectives to feed our own traumas. I wished Archie was with me here right now. I haven't seen her since she helped me move out of my old place, more than a year ago. But she does not run in these social circles, and I was hardly going to be able to get my gender-bending sidekick into these affairs as my +1. I've never been what I'd call a stylish dresser, but I do keep up. Just because I did the hippie chick thing for a few years doesn't mean I don't know what Spanx are for. And I've been in goth and other subculture scenes since I was in college. I've worn more uncomfortable things than this, many times. I'm not new to sensory detail. I could describe in luxurious, almost pornographic detail what it was like to sheathe myself in a catsuit, fishnets, or thigh-high platform boots. I absolutely love looking good, and I don't care how much it hurts in the process. You've got to suffer to be beautiful, or something. Difference is, I was doing it for me. If other people found me attractive, that was great, but it was also incidental. The only opinion that mattered was who was looking in the mirror. The makeup artist patted my shoulder and looked over at Cassie. I was ready, I guess. I looked at myself, my dress, my hat, my tasteful jewelry, my formerly electric blue hair back to its original shade of red. I look perfect, I said. I hate it, I thought silently. Joke's on them, though. Seeing my flaming red hair again after a few years of experimenting with colors only reminded me of my stubbornness and temper. I'm a redhead offspring of 2 full-blooded Irish people. Of course I'm going to have a temper like a wild cat. I don't think Cassie believed me, but she only cared that I said the right things.
See? Not so hard, Angela. You're never properly dressed without a good attitude. Isn't it nice to be dressing decently again instead of those horrible costumes you ran around in?
I gave a non-committal nod. You know what I like about subculture clothing? Everyone's in on the illusion. Nobody really believes that the drag queen or the goth princess or the dominatrix look like that all the time. We agree to a temporary shared game where we put on these outrageous faces, and in the process reveal our real selves. Nothing about me looks outrageous. We spent more time just prepping my makeup today so it doesn't look like I'm wearing a lot of makeup than I sometimes did on my entire makeup routine on club nights. My modest yellow and white sundress is perfectly reasonable. I look like a very classy version of a girl you might see at the coffee shop. And there's nothing of my real self. I'm an Instagram post. It's more fake than anything you'll see at goth night. Underneath that tasteful dress are multiple layers of squeezing torture garments designed to look like they're not even there, to give the impression your body is naturally the perfectly toned, lithe shape men desire. That's why I like corsets in the scene. No illusions about what's creating that shape. I'll wear 5-inch platform boots with high heels that make my feet ache for days and still feel like the most powerful person in the room. Strapping myself into stylish, reasonably comfortable 3-inch heels feels like I'm holding my arms out for a straitjacket. Someone deposits a floppy white hat on my head. I suppose it looks cute. I'm a perfect little late summer single rich girl ready to politely clap and cheer on her golfer boyfriend, or something. I wondered if any of the men who would be on the prowl for me were putting anywhere near as much thought into their appearance as hunters as I was required to for my own as prey. I conclusively, and incidentally incorrectly, decided the answer was no. One last detail remained. I was hoping I wouldn't have to do it, but hope is in short supply these days. Cassie leaned over and pinned a small brooch on my left breast, just above my heart. A simple coat of arms, a silver Z, surrounded by a ring of roses, topped with a tiara. Barely 2 inches wide, but a key that opened doors I didn't even know existed, so I'm told. I'm told a lot of things about this pin, mind you. There are more living Medal of Honor recipients than there are people entitled to wear this thing. A symbol of the title most attached to me that I spoke of least, Regna's Own, a graduate of the ultra-exclusive Qualtis Academy for the Refinement of Young Women, aka the Overseas Charm School from Hell, where I spent my 19th and 20th birthdays, isolated from my family, all alone, and surrounded by enemies. Enemies, and worse. The pin was an honor paid for by millions from my family bank account and vast oceans of my own blood and tears. I'd never think about it again, if I could. I won't be so lucky. Man, I have a lot of main character syndrome for someone who has so rarely felt in control of her own life. Cassie regarded me gravely. My eyes lit on her own lapel, where she wore the same icon on a small pin. She quietly tapped her heart with 2 fingers as she leveled eye contact with me. A tradition far older than either of us, and not understood by anyone in this room. I responded by tapping the pin over my own heart twice. It wasn't easy for me to do that, not to exchange this very private salute with Aunt Cassie of all people. But I doubt it was easy to initiate for her either. And with that, it was time to make our grand exit. As we departed the manor for the event, I overheard Josephine intone,
Scarlet is on the move.
Into her ever-present earpiece like she was Secret Service, totally sealing the surreal nature of my whole life now. I don't remember much about the ride from our manor to the clubhouse. I guess I'm supposed to feel like the limo is a chariot, but I still feel like I'm being delivered as the guest of honor to a virgin sacrifice. Well, a sacrifice anyway. The path from Claire de Lune to the country club followed a long, lazy path around the outer edge of Summersfall, giving a nearly endless view of New Hampshire woodlands to the west and the city and sea to the east. I mentally followed the path of distant lights and smoke trails in the sea to the dock district at the southwest edge of town. The busiest section of Summersfall and the poorest, home of the dock rats. My home, once upon a very long ago time. I busied myself by rolling a quarter over my knuckles, one of those little tricks you learn when you have a lot of time to yourself and very few entertainments. It was a bicentennial quarter. One of my father's little quirks was that he always collected them and considered them good luck. When I got bored with that, I idly started tapping the coin on the window, sounding out a familiar beat. Familiar to Cassie and me, at least. Doom, 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 tek-a-tek. Then another rhythm. Familiar from another lifetime and another continent ago. Doom. Doom, 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 tek-a-tek. Cassie leveled a harsh glare at me on that one. She didn't want to draw attention to it, but she wanted to make sure I understood her disapproval. I basically stayed numb, followed along, and did what I was told as we made our way into the club. I was all too aware of eyes on me and tried to ignore them. The country club's Labor Day golf event is pretty standard. Lunch, much milling about, and cocktails. Most of the men hit the greens and leave the women to the tea room, then formal dinner. It's not really about the event so much as who's there. Some men stick around while the others are on the greens. The ones socializing with the women are the ones you know are on the prowl for a wife. In our culture, pushing 30 without getting married is viewed highly suspiciously. My family is well aware that they're desperate to marry me off. All the men who try to talk to me are aware of this too. If they're flirting with a single 29-year-old at the country club, they're desperate for a good match too. I amuse myself by calling them kingfishers. They have an outsized idea of how big a fish they actually are. That's where things stood when I was sipping a drink, sighing internally, and trying not to roll my eyes as the Labor Day crowd filled up the clubhouse lounge. The least valuable people in this room were worth 8 figures, and quite frankly, my crowd anxiety was kicking in. I was always nervous in large groups, and the manhandling I endured at the Qualtis Academy made me edgy at being jostled. But I've learned a lot of exercises to keep it under control. It's funny. Shut me up in a coffin and I can take a nap. Put me under a tent with 100 people and my heart rate jumps. I say sipping, and I mean it. The amount of effort required to go to the restroom in these garments made me well aware of how I needed to pace myself for drinking. I'm convinced that the difficulty in this basic task is another level of intentional control. The sun started streaming through the windows, and I instinctively went for my sunglasses, but realized I'd left them back home in the morning rush. Any staffer here would fetch me a pair at a snap of my fingers, but I was too damn stubborn to ask anyone for anything. A snap of my fingers. I sighed. Back in the day, that's all it took to get Archie to do anything. Honestly, she was usually already ahead of me. My personal shades spent most of the time inside a case in the satchel Archie carried on duty that she always seemed to know exactly what she needed to pull out of it before I did. I'd be squinting in the sun, and before I knew it, the shades were held out right in front of me. I liked those old shades, which were a bit of a relic from my time in the Qualtese Academy. I promise there's more on all that later on, and I mean much more. But for the moment, just imagine a version of The Princess Diaries where the princess really doesn't want to be there and gets spanked for trying to leave. The place had this whole old-timey, high-luxury flair thing going on, and everything was custom-made. My bespoke shades had a nifty rectangular wraparound on the sides for a neat little steampunk look. Apparently they really wore shades like that in Victorian times and called them railway glasses. They looked great. They were basically indestructible, and I still haven't ever found a pair of polarized shades that are half as good. I lost track of them when I had to move back home in kind of a hurry. They're in my storage unit, maybe. Probably, I hope.
Hello there, Miss Deluna.
Oh, damn, I forgot people were actually going to talk to me, and the first Kingfisher introduces himself while I'm wrapped up in thinking about my old shades, which are still more interesting than he is. I barely hear his name. Something Carbonell. I know his family, rich even by our standards, with a lot of overseas investments of highly dubious ethics. He makes eye contact, gives a firm but not too firm handshake, and smiles. He does everything right. It doesn't matter. I know he doesn't see me at all. My aunt keeps me in sight at all times. Oh yes, ever since all this started, I've been closely chaperoned. I'm never allowed out in public without supervision. Even if I'm just stopping in at the grocery store, she asks me to take Penny with me. Penny doesn't even know she's my chaperone. It's just that both Cassie and I know full well she'll spill anything interesting she sees, especially if I do anything at all scandalous. Another reason I haven't seen Archie in a year. I don't live a life where I can pop on down to the bar to meet up with one of my friends from the goth scene. Out of the question for a respectable young lady, you understand. It's like living in Regency or Victorian times, except most people don't think this lifestyle even exists anymore. And if they do, they're jealous. They're welcome to it if they want. Had I been born a man, I'd be the eldest heir. I'd be running this family, and even Aunt Cassie would acknowledge my authority as soon as Dad died. But all they see is a girl who has to be forced to be respectable. My would-be suitor tries to make conversation. It's not going well.
I like your makeup. Very nice and basic. I think women who wear too much makeup just look like they've spray-painted themselves, don't you?
Yes, of course, sir. I will heed the informed opinion of a man who has no idea how much makeup I'm really wearing right now. I think but do not say. Perhaps it allows you to see me for who I really am instead of a pretty face, I respond coyly. Such a blow I'm striking for feminism. Hidden sarcasm is the one weapon I have left. My life is all the boring parts of a Hallmark holiday movie as narrated by Daria Morgendorfer. I find my amusement where I can. Not that it matters. I'm fooling myself if I think anything I say makes a difference. I'm wrapped up in a cocoon designed to create the perfect tummy, thighs, and bottom, while looking like I'm fluttering under a simple dress. I wonder if he knows there's about as much science as a space launch involved in creating that flawless set of proportions, that down-to-the-millimeter perfection for his pleasure. I'm still a little thrown off by how constricting all this is. With the voice of experience, I can tell you that panty girdles definitely impede sex more than a chastity belt, and take a lot longer to remove. At least my current conversational partner is reasonably attractive. Proof positive that sexual orientation isn't a choice, or else I'd have been done with men long ago. Lucky for him, because he has no conversational skills. We talk a bit, useless chatter really, He laughs at my gentle jokes and I slightly flirt. My aunt must have picked up something because she squeezes my arm and hisses in my ear to stop acting like a slut. Well, excuse me for having interests and finding something that makes all this bearable for 5 seconds. I catch him out of the corner of my eye as we hustle away. He's more interested than I'd prefer in exactly how high my hemline hangs. Maybe it's for the best that I don't talk more to him. I should mention that I was kind of a black sheep long before I ditched the family business. I don't know exactly how Mom ended up with my stepdad, since I was 5 years old at the time, barely a kindergartner, but it was apparently head-over-heels romance. We were all alone after my birth father, sperm donor really, ran out on us when I was 3. George McCormick resented Mom for getting pregnant, and me for even existing. But Daniel Deluna loved both of us, and he risked a lot of social standing by marrying broke, divorced, nurse-turned-waitress Jessica McCormick, going by her maiden name of Maher, and adopting her daughter that still bore her father's name. I suppose there was something very little orphan Annie about the whole thing, although for the most part this was always the life I knew. Even if my relatives never let me entirely forget, I wasn't quite one of them. My mom always told me to be grateful for the entree he provided into high society and the way he took care of us. As far as the family was concerned, he was already a big-time rebel. He is what this culture considers to be a progressive firebrand. You can imagine how much social affection flowed to Mom and me. At their wedding, my new dad gave me a silver pin with an angel's wings against the moon and told me he'd gotten it long ago on the other side of the world. Angela Deluna, it was called. Angel of the moon, a guardian of women in need of help. Like it was fate that I'd be his daughter, he said. I cherish that thing. I don't have it at the moment, but it's in a very safe place. Let me be clear, I loved him. He's my dad. He's the one who raised me and taught me to drive and figured he was being a good dad by showing me how to fight off male attackers. Elbow to the face, knee to the groin, then run like hell, was his advice. I miss him a lot. I wish I knew more about him. He was apparently quite the outlier and standards breaker in his youth, and since his last and biggest scandal was marrying my mom, everyone was eager to just act like everything was normal. He was older than Mom, by more than 20 years, in fact. I wondered about that sometimes. Why he got married in his 40s when it's a big scandal around here if you're single in your 30s. Nobody ever talked about what he was like before Mom, especially him. Aunt Cassie let slip once, when I was a teenager, that he was married once before, when he was traveling the world, met a bride overseas, and brought her back home and totally shocked the social scene. Then she died young. Cancer. I couldn't get Cassie to tell me much more, and because I was a teen with an attitude, I didn't actually think my dad's life was interesting enough to go bug him about it. Then I went to college and got married, and now it's 10 years later and I'll never know about most of his life. I always thought there would be time. He was old-fashioned and set in his ways, and he came up with this stupid conservatorship idea, and he did a lot of things I hold against him, but I still loved him, you know. I never thought of him as any less my dad just because he's not blood. Mostly, I only thought less of him over the etiquette academy that left permanent scars on my rear. He and I share a natural sixth sense. I have a couple, actually. We all have them, you know, we just don't realize it. Like people who can always just sort of tell where north is because some part of their body is attuned to magnetism better than most. Me, I can feel lightning a few seconds before it strikes, even miles away. No idea why. Maybe I'm just attuned to the ions, but I get that little sense of hair standing up and I just know. Dad and I shared that particular skill. Maybe it was his seafaring experience. Maybe we just share the same weird genetic quirk. Whatever the case, I can usually sense lightning several seconds before it strikes, and so could he. Makes for a good party trick on occasion. We'd joke about it, and it was kind of our thing, you know. Look to the lightning, he liked to tell me when I was a little girl. Look to the lightning, and you'll find me. They were pretty words. Once upon a time, I believed them. Let's just say the rest of Dad's family does not feel the same way about me. As far as they're concerned, Mom was his weird hobby, and I'm the embarrassing charity case. Things got worse after Mom died in an auto accident when I was 10. Actually, getting killed rescuing others from an accident, which is exactly how Mom was destined to go out. and Dad turned to his sister-in-law as my female role model and tutor in the social graces. Cassie was a nightmare to grow up with. Obsessed with keeping our status and making sure all my escapades didn't ruin the family's good name. She apparently believed she inherited her mother's role of social matriarch and making sure her kooky older brother-in-law didn't mess things up more than he already had, and especially that his bad seed daughter didn't ruin anything now. She was less terrifying than her husband, though. Dad's older brother, Victor Deluna, was a stern patriarch in the oldest mode. The closest thing he came to affection was letting me call him Uncle Vic. From the 1970s onward, Preserver Society all turned to Uncle Vic for leadership. He believed in running things with a firm hand, and even Dad seemed intimidated by him. He wore his authority like a dark cloak that surrounded all of us. When Dad took over as paterfamilias, he never wore the authority with the same ease. Aunt Cassie, on the other hand, is the kind of woman who says with a straight face, the only degree a woman needs from college is her MRS. Even others in this circle are intimidated by her as the grande dame of high society around here. When Mom died, Aunt Cassie had already married off both her older daughters. That's how she sees these things. Married off, and was all too happy to take over my education in all things aristocratic and correct. She takes her job very seriously. Taming the wildcat who dropped out of pre-law to major in women's studies, wear a lot of garish lipstick and fishnets, and dye her hair all the colors of the rainbow. Did I say job? Honestly, I think taming me is her favorite hobby. More talk, more chatter. The kingfishers all blur together. It's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Deluna. Blah. It's formal and I know it, but there's something in the way they say it. A subtle giveaway of intent. Miss Deluna. The only two important factors were my unmarried status and my father's surname. That's all that mattered. They could gauge my availability and my worth to them as a trophy wife. Miss means I'm available. Deluna means I'm important and have money. All the while, my aunt circles, keeping an eye on the sharks. Josephine also mingles and looks like she's doing business. In her sharp, pinstripe skirt suit, she stands out as not one of the Labor Day crowd, but also not one of the staffers either. She reminds me of an intense wedding planner watching as things are in motion and carefully noting if anything falls out of place. I have no idea what she's thinking, which makes her scarier than my aunt. I don't have to get engaged today, of course. This is all about feeling out options, exploring the prospects, making an impression. The intent of this cattle call is to eventually be swept off my feet by a dashing stranger. Little did I know this was actually about to happen. It's like an unofficial receiving line as the kingfishers come to me, some speaking for 2 sentences, others being granted an audience of 10 or 15 minutes, depending on my mood and how quickly my aunt would shoo them away, like she was dragging them off stage with an oversized crook. One Miss Deluna after another. Miss Deluna always sounded different when coming out of Archie's mouth. It was the same deferential tone she'd used when I was her one-woman finishing school and headmistress. These men used Miss Deluna as a sign of my powerlessness, to remind me how little my actual self matters. She said Miss Deluna in the tone you'd use when addressing someone who could wrap a cane across your knuckles at any moment. I preferred her way.
Hey Angie, long time, no see.
At last, a familiar face and a much less awkward approach. Len Claremont, same age as me, lanky and lean with boyish good looks and glasses that he wore to make himself look smart, which I have to admit all added up to catnip for me. And I know damn well I was catnip for him. We lost our virginity to each other in high school, so at least we knew we were sexually compatible. But if he was 29 years old and cruising this scene for a woman, something had gone very wrong. I smirked. I've turned smirking into an art form lately. Last I heard, you were engaged to Andy Beaumont. He looked nervous.
Let's just say you were a tough act to follow.
Honestly, I was beginning to wonder why Len and I hadn't become more of a thing.
Angela Eleanor Deluna.
A deep voice boomed out. Oh yes, that was why. I hadn't heard it in more than a decade, but it was impossible to miss. Walter Claremont, Len's father, and as imposing and self-important a man as I have ever met. He looks like Richie Rich's dad would in real life. 300 pounds, 6 foot 4 inches, and absolutely convinced of his own superiority.
I see the rumors are true. The dock rat really has come crawling home.
Hello, Walt, I said in a skeptical tone. Of all the elder preservers in Summersfall, he was always the loudest about Dad marrying that waitress and her daughter. Nobody ever said, that award-winning nurse. She was defined solely by the job she had at the lowest point in her life. As far as they were concerned, she could never be good enough for them, and her daughter was less than nothing.
That's Mr. Claremont to you, young lady,
he said sternly, looking down at me and pulling himself up to his full height. Seriously, man, I'm only 5'2" myself. It's not like you need to seem even taller than me to feel important. 29 years old, Walt. Hardly a young lady.
Humph. All this time and nobody's put you in your place.
I took in a deep breath. Okay. Let the breath out. We're going to go there. And how exactly would you do that, Walt?
Over my knees, panties pulled down and squirming while my right hand reddens your bottom with a lesson you'll never forget. I just might have to do that to teach my son how to handle a woman anyway.
He drew out every word, pouring lascivious glee into every syllable. I guess when you're Walt's age and your wife hates you, you take your romantic fantasies where you can get. I stepped in closer. My defiance fueled my righteous anger. If not for how tightly my abs were strapped into place, I'd have been belly to belly with him. Is that the preserver way now? Standards have slipped since my uncle's day if you're scheming to exercise prima nocte spanking rights over your daughter-in-law on her wedding night. You're probably salivating at throwing me over your lap in my old tartan skirt, getting a stiffy at the very thought. I swear I could literally see fumes rise from his head as his face reddened and his lips trembled as he struggled to form a response. If he'd possessed a lick of authority over me, at this very moment, I really would be across his lap. A firm hand grabbed my arm and saved Walt from having to waste his breath on whatever lecture he was going to give.
Angela, with me, now.
Josephine wasted no words as she half-guided, half-dragged me to one of the numerous refreshment clubhouses that dotted the area. She unlocked one that was equipped as a minibar, led me in, and locked the door behind us. We would have privacy for what she intended. I turned to her while making the mistake of putting on a defiant stance. Come on, Josephine, that wasn't... She slapped my face suddenly and casually, like it was nothing to her. Probably it wasn't.
Ms. Hedges, you've already gotten off to a disrespectful start. I promise you don't want to earn any more demerits right now.
I remained silent. I knew better than to try to argue with Josephine when she was in punishment mode. If it seems like I'm taking this surprisingly well, the one thing I have going for me is that it's not possible for her to hurt me more than that school already did. Josephine dug through her bag and withdrew a short, thick leather strap attached to a wood handle.
Over the bar, spread your arms out and your legs apart.
I decided to try logic. Ms. Hedges, you know how much effort went into keeping my outfit perfect today. She would have none of it.
Rest assured, young lady, that I am well aware of what I am doing. Your girdle, panties, and stockings will provide you with minimal protection, but I promise that I can strike perfectly well without upsetting your wardrobe. Now do as you have been told.
I sighed and rolled my eyes when she couldn't see them. No use arguing now. I leaned across the bar, stretched my arms out to each side, and stood up on my tiptoes as I spread my legs. Josephine calmly lifted my sundress, which was no problem. It was by far the lightest thing I was wearing. She tucked it into my girdle. A couple of layers of nylon and spandex still stretched across my bottom, but I knew she wasn't joking when she said they wouldn't protect me, not from that fearsome leather strap. She stood behind me calmly.
I believe your scars are right at the line where the girdle and panty overlap.
I nodded. It was an odd point of courtesy between Josephine and I. She was one of very few people who knew about the scars crisscrossing the top of my rear end and how they got there. Out of respect, she always made sure to avoid them when spanking me. I appreciated that a great deal.
Very well then. Prepare yourself. 2 blows for disrespecting Mr. Claremont, 2 for using my first name, and 2 for your general attitude today.
Josephine lifted the leather strap, tested its weight, and took a couple of light swats at my bottom, testing her aim and placement. Then she pulled back and I held my breath, knowing what was coming next. Her arm swung in a wide arc. The tawse smacked my bottom, and I could already feel red welts forming beneath my shapewear. Taking this thing off was going to be awkward and tender tonight. I gritted my teeth and tried not to cry out. I've been spanked more times than I can count by this point, and every time I forget how bad it really hurt until the hits actually came. Another blow came, this time from the other side, and more quickly than I expected. I yelped at this one. This was a cold whipping, no warm-up, accelerating to full speed with the first stroke and not letting up. Josephine had taken up a position where she could basically strike like a tennis player, smacking alternately with forehand and backhand, and I don't know which is worse. Her blows were mechanical, precise, crisp, and excruciating. Her secret was using her hips to pivot her whole body. She barely even had to use her arm. Turning her body powered the strap to pummel my rear and keep on going. At one point, Josephine taught me how to do this, by using the strap to whip a punching bag. When I asked why I needed to learn it, she said I would be disciplining girls of my own someday, and I should learn to do it right. I told her I would never treat any relative of mine like this, and she just laughed. She paused just a moment between each stroke, her arm at maximum extension, and ready to beat me again. Every stroke thundered down and pain burst like a bomb on my bottom. It took me a long time to learn to use the strap to Josephine's satisfaction. Even just using it on a punching bag, back and forth, I couldn't help but imagine what it would be like to punish a person by powering the strap so hard against them. I'm not that cruel. Eventually, I managed to learn to put my whole body into it by imagining it was a very specific person that I was beating. I kept my crying to a minimum, can't smear that makeup after all, but sniffled and whimpered badly. I always hated this part. Every spanking, I was sure that this time was the one where I could hold it together and maintain my dignity. I was always wrong. I'm 29 years old, being treated like a child who won't sit still in church, and now I'm crying like one too. Josephine calmly took a moment to smooth out her jacket and walk around me.
Listen carefully. As far as your aunt or anyone here knows, I merely took you aside for some momentary coaching and you're taking a break to compose yourself.
She moved a clock on the bar so it was in my field of vision.
Remain in position for 15 minutes, then rejoin the festivities with a significantly improved attitude. I am going to do you a favor and forget this little moment happened, but I advise that you do not. I want you to spend that time thinking about how disrespectful you have been and the ingratitude you show to all those who have worked and sacrificed to get you where you are.
She paused a moment.
And most of all,
one more strike came out of nowhere, scorching my bottom and causing me to cry out in shock and pain.
most of all, you will think about how very, very vulnerable you are.
She paused.
I understand your resistance more than you think, but I also understand it is futile. You have no hope, Angela. Nobody is coming to help you. The discipline I offer is what you get to help you.
Then she departed, leaving me alone. That said it all about how confident Josephine felt in her control over me. I was ordered to hold a difficult position, and she didn't even bother to supervise me. She assumed I would follow her orders, and she was right, because I was afraid of her. I was afraid of more pain and humiliation. I was every bit as vulnerable as she said. She and Cassie and essentially any man in this circle could do whatever they wanted to me. If Mr. Claremont had asked Cassie, she'd have let him put me over his knee for an old-fashioned spanking, right in front of everyone. If I kept this up, sooner or later, he probably would. Despite all my bravado, I was afraid of all the forces aligned against me. I was afraid of how I might be punished by my eventual husband. I was afraid of giving up my entire identity, and most of all, I was afraid of a new set of scars being added to my bottom if I really ticked off the wrong person. I had a long 15 minutes to think about what I wanted to do with my life. I could keep playing the wildcat, sure, but to what end? I was no masochist. Well, not much of one anyway. I took no pleasure in these spankings and this treatment. And as entertaining as it was to get on everyone's nerves and make them pay for this in the only way I was capable of completing, the punishment I received in return would be far worse. If you're having a good time, 15 minutes will fly by. If you're spread out on a bar recovering from a spanking and trying not to cry your eyes out while you think about the hopelessness of your position, let me tell you, 15 minutes seem like forever. Okay, the only logical choice before me is to advance the pieces a little bit. And I knew how to do it. I just didn't like it. Only when the 15 minutes ticked by and I was allowed to stand up again did I fully wrap my mind around what I had to do. To be honest, it took just about that long to overcome the panic riding in my throat. I composed myself, adjusted my girdle and dress, rubbed my bottom. Just the thought of surrendering like this made my scars start to throb and exited the building back into the bright, late summer afternoon. Nobody seemed to have taken note of my absence as I walked back into the concourse where people still milled about. This was an all-day social event. Josephine was right when she said our disappearing for a little while wouldn't attract attention. I took a moment to pause and survey the scene, but mostly just to calm my nerves. I angled myself just slightly and protectively wrapped my arm around myself and hugged my upper arm with the other hand. I didn't notice I was doing it for a moment. Then I stopped myself and shook it off. An old nervous habit from my time overseas. I'd get clutched by the arm and dragged around so often that I learned to tell people apart when I was blindfolded just by how they manhandled me. The weird proficiency slots you fill in a life like mine. So I ended up rubbing my own sore arm a lot. On the back end of my marriage, I picked it back up again as a nervous habit. It took years and a little insight from Archie to realize what I was doing, and I quit out of disgust not long after. I felt fidgety, small, insignificant when I was hugging myself like that. Until today, I hadn't done it since I came back to this life. I wonder if I'm just that vulnerable, or if I'm just that scared. Off to one side, Josephine and Aunt Cassie were conferring about something. Across the concourse near the bar, I saw Len sipping a drink and checking his phone. Good. He was alone. That would make this easier. I summoned up all my courage. Okay, Angie, you can do this. It took most of the willpower I had to continue a ladylike walk. My legs felt like logs, and I was so numb that I wanted to do a Frankenstein walk instead. But I made it work. I always do. It's not like I was proposing marriage, just proposing courtship. But that was probably going to lead to marriage. And more immediately, it meant that I was submitting to their will, agreeing to play the game by their rules. But Josephine had been right. The idea that I had any power over my own future was an illusion, and she had painfully and degradingly made that clear. I had been alone and with my back against the wall for 6 incredibly draining months. I'm really underselling how painfully lonely the months since Dad's death have been. No contact with the outside world. No friends outside my prescribed social circle. Josephine was my only regular social contact. Penny was my only genuine friend. I really was a damsel locked in a tower, but there was no hero riding to my rescue. The only way out of my prison was to find myself a prince to marry. Len would do. He liked me enough not to be too cruel, and I'm sure I could at least pretend to knuckle under to him enough to keep his dad happy. I'd live in a gilded cage, but at least not a painful one. Len was on the other side of the green. 50 feet, Angie. It would be that easy. Walk up to Len and say it. I could even hear my own casually cocky voice as I mentally rehearsed it. You know what, Len? You're cute, I'm hot, and we're both rich. How about we make a go of it? Hell, I wouldn't need to do even that much work. Walk 50 feet, say the words, Len, I would like you to court me, and let him do the rest. Maybe dress it up with some real formal language for that Charlotte Bronte touch. It's not like I wasn't trained in courtly speech. Mr. Claremont, I would be most grateful if you would accept my invitation to courtship. Yeah, that would do it. The exaggerated formality would add enough of a touch of surreal humor that I might retain a sliver of self-respect. Everything would run on autopilot from there. That's the rare upside of being a woman in this patriarchal preserver's world. If you have no self-ambition, you can just let other people do all the work. I say those words, he takes over, and by year's end, I'd be in the wedding of the decade. Walt would love planning every moment of the humiliating ceremony of his son at last claiming the wildcat. Maybe he'd even respect Len for once. Nearby, I passed Sally Ortegas and Andrea Elliott, old classmates, long since married off. They both turned their heads away from me. Good. I didn't want them seeing this. I noticed Melinda giving instructions to Sylvie and Bridget over by the bar. I envied them for the simplicity of their lives. I'd rather be a maid than a rich man's fetish doll. Of course, I'd really just rather have my old life back where I did what I wanted and had my own volunteer maid who would do whatever I asked of her. Oh, my old life. Long days at Thornbooks, watching imported anime DVDs to pass the time. Nights at the Goth Club, with Araceli and Lynette and Anna and Skye and Morrigan and all the others in Thornback Island, striding through like we owned the place. I pushed the thoughts out of my mind. That life happened to someone else. Not me. Not anymore. 50 feet of walking, and I would put that Angie on a shelf for good, replaced with Mrs. Angela Claremont. The thought hurt less than I expected it would. Must be getting numb. I suppose that's a blessing. The orchestra started playing an arrangement of a pop song that had been big a few years earlier, the good old Summersfall cultural context once again, and the pounding beats started to echo in my head. I remembered something Penny had said about planning a live dance on her stream to this song, and sure enough, I noticed her and her whole crew up on the veranda making quite the spectacle of themselves. I suppose it attracted attention, and why not? This place can be dead boring, and you need something to break up the monotony, and quite a few people who'd been milling around started walking across the main concourse in the opposite direction I was going. Crowds! Bloody hell! I've been edgy around crowds ever since Qualta whipped any sense of privacy or personal boundaries out of me. I should have just stopped. Taken a deep breath. Let the moment of crowd anxiety pass. But common sense isn't my thing on the best of days. And this wasn't one of those. My heart started to beat faster. No, damn it. No, not now. Not here. Not in front of them. But of course, the very fear fed in itself. And despite my best efforts, I started hyperventilating and my eyes dilated hard. I hated that. I've seen myself in the mirror with my eyes bugging out and I look ridiculous. I'd stop it if I could. But old anxiety Angie has been like this as long as she can remember. Dilated eyes used to be a sign of beauty. Those and rosy cheeks. I tried to think of Archie. I would stride through crowds with perfect ease and confidence with her by my side. That only reminded me how I was never going to see her again. Remember what I said about lightning? In the middle of this whole attack, I felt that exact sensation. Which was insane. Not a cloud in the sky. Probably just the hypervigilance of being first raised by a woman from the streets and then by a pit of vipers where the wrong glance or gesture might get my bottom smacked with a spoon. Everything on high alert. Incoming threat! I'm not dense. I know why this is happening. I'm having the most stressful day in years. I've been panicky all day. Nobody is going to help me. I just got whipped damned hard. I'm crowd anxious, and I'm in a crowd. Someone is coming to get you, Angie. Surrounded by hunters, and you're nothing but prey. Run, and I'm about to do something I really don't want to do. You don't need the Scooby Gang to solve the mystery of why my entire body was at DEFCON 1. Voices from the past, maybe elsewhere too.
Look to the lightning.
I've never seen you like this
You
before.
honor us with your presence, Regnia Zone.
Sideways and always, like my father and my husband
Like
did.
her mother did.
Are you ready to save the world?
Nobody is coming to help me. Justice, like lightning.
You deserved better.
Angie, it's go time.
Always
Get the
be
bleeding
my
kit.
mistress, Miss Deluna.
One day.
No one should
Nobody
ever be
is coming
alone
to
while
help
doing
me.
something
Is
stupid.
today.
Perish the thought, ma'am.
But still, I turned, trying to get my bearings. Damn, now I was dizzy too. All these months closing in on me and I was about to close my own cage door. No, Angie, don't. Dad, why did you do this to me? No, don't go there. Keep Dad out of this. I snapped my eyes open. I needed an anchor, any anchor. Find a pivot point, orient on Len, keep going. Someone was coming up behind me, on my left side. He stood out because he was going against the flow, too. Not enough to be threatening, quite the opposite. It felt casual, like a friend's approach. Out of place for all these manly men doing their manly man power games. He walked right past me like he belonged there. Perfectly tailored, dark Armani suit. Far too at ease with all this stuff compared to the predators on the prowl for a mate, but an intense focus on wherever he was going. I didn't get a look at his face. I saw Bridget walking in my general direction, carrying a tray with a single wine glass, and homed in on her. Bridget plus proximity to me plus wine sure explained the threat sense. She was going against the crowd as well, both of us coming in opposite directions perpendicular to the motion. Understand, this all happened in a couple of seconds. This wasn't a mass stampede. This was navigating a decent-sized crowd at the mall on a reasonably busy day and trying to go against the flow. An awkward situation, but hardly a terrifying one. Unless you have a crippling anxiety of crowds and nobody has allowed you so much as a single tablet of Xanax in 6 months. My eyes darted about as I stepped a few feet aside of Bridget. The sole wine glass on her plate was half full. Funny the things you notice when your senses blaze out of control. Shame, shame, Bridget. You shouldn't be sneaking sips. As Bridget passed me, my eyes kept moving beyond, frantically scanning for the threat, and letting her out of my sight. Now that was a mistake. My eyes were as wide as they can get, and my hyperventilation was expanding. Please, please, please give me just 1 minute of strength. I heard a thump behind me and whirled. Too late to do anything to protect myself. A mass of black and white fabric and blonde hair careened my way, Bridget experiencing a trip and fall that would have been truly impressive if not for the fact it was coming right at me and I was about to have a flying wine glass break in my face. I felt someone bump into me hard from behind, their back to mine, knocking me out of the path of the glass. In the blur, I saw a hand neatly catch the wine glass in the air as easily as a slow pitch. I tumbled forward as a man's arm wrapped hard around my waist. Nothing good ever came of being grabbed like that. That seventh sense about being manhandled kicked in. Whoever was snatching me at the waist had never done it before. My savior or captor, I still wasn't sure yet, spun with me. I was already dizzy enough, and by now I was completely disoriented. He carried all the momentum of my nearly disastrous fall and redirected into such a twirl, you'd think we were ballroom dancers. He finished the turn, absorbing all the momentum, and let me dip exactly like he really was dancing, my body all but a rag doll in his grip, looking down into my panicked eyes with a smirk and a twinkle in his eyes, a handsome man with slender, soft features and tousled, mousy brown hair and glasses as he held me with one hand and downed the rest of that wine glass with the other.
It's all right, Miss Deluna. Everything's all right. I've got you.
You've got me? I gasped. Who's... My voice crashed straight to a halt. My eyes must have been so wide they were visible from space, and my chest was heaving with the panic attack still underway and escalated by the adrenaline rush. But it eased as I looked into the one set of eyes on the entire planet that could have possibly calmed me down. My mouth made several motions without actually creating sound. Finally, I managed a tight whisper. Archie?
I'm always on duty, Miss Deluna, and you'll always be my mission.
Stories aren't written about women like me, Archie. They're written for me, to me, against me, but never about me. Women aren't the hero's journey. Women are the destination.